The second you walk into your church as their new pastor, you're going to identify some things that you'd like to change. We're going to talk about some questions you may need to consider before you actually make the change on this episode of the Starting Well podcast. Welcome to the Starting Well podcast. Whether you are a new pastor or you're beginning to serve in a new church, this podcast is designed to help you start well. I'm your host, Jason Lowe, and I serve as a regional consultant with the Kentucky Baptist Convention. And I am so glad that you've joined us for this episode. Let's get started. When I first began to serve as a pastor, I served in a small church, but a wonderful, loving, patient church. I came in as a young, inexperienced pastor who unfortunately thought he knew a lot more about church ministry than he actually knew. And as I began serving in this church, I began to implement changes. I would make changes to the worship service, changes to the Wednesday night prayer meeting, changes to who prayed over the offering, all these changes very quickly. I even created a new bulletin for the church, all within the first month, because I saw all of these things that needed to change, and I was just quick to make those changes without considering how they would impact others in the church, and how I would spend a lot of leadership capital very early on. And if you're listening to this as a new pastor, then you probably understand that temptation. You come into a church and you see things that need to change, and some of them are certainly needed changes, but others are preference issues, and you had that temptation, you've probably heard it in previous episodes, to rush to make those changes. And I'm not saying all change is bad, but you need to be careful about how you make those changes. And so on today's episode, we're going to be talking about some questions that you need to consider as you begin to think about changes you want to make in the church and how those would impact other people and the long-term effect of those changes. And so to join me in this conversation today, I'm going to be talking to Jeff Crabtree. Jeff serves as a regional consultant, just like me, in the Kentucky Baptist Convention. He serves in the South Central region. And Jeff is going to talk to us about these questions. He wrote an article. You can find it on our website at startingwell.net, where he lists 6 different questions to ask before implementing major change in your church. And so we're going to have that conversation with him in just a moment. And we're going to split this conversation, just like we did with Alan Witham, over 2 episodes. And so today you're going to hear the first 3 questions. And then next week, we're going to finish this conversation with the last 3 questions, along with some other topics that we'll talk about. And so I hope that you enjoy this conversation that I had recently with Jeff Crabtree. All right, Jeff, welcome to the Starting Well podcast.
Thanks, Jason. Glad to be here, man.
Absolutely. So, Jeff, tell our listeners a little bit about yourself, your ministry, and your role with the Kentucky Baptist Convention.
All right. Well, currently I serve as a regional consultant for the South Central region, covering a territory of roughly 440 churches, helping with everything from pastor search to conflict resolution to just pastor encouragement, pastor development. A lot of things like that. I've served as director of missions in Warren County for a number of years, served as associate pastor, done a lot of discipleship, faith development, administrative stuff. So that's kind of been my roles.
You've got that experience, and I think that'll be helpful for our listeners as we talk about, in this particular episode, a new pastor comes into a church. He's going to see things almost immediately that he would like to change. And so we want to talk about on this episode how he can strategically think through those changes. And so we want to talk about specifically questions that that new pastor needs to ask or consider before he implements major change. And so, Jeff, as we just kind of dive into some of these questions today, let's start by just talking through why is it important for a new pastor to think carefully before he begins to implement major change in his church?
The first thing you got to think about in change for the pastor is your change sets a viewpoint to the whole congregation. So those first few changes begin a congregation seeing how you're going to react, what you're going to see. And I think the other side of that is, especially if you're a new pastor sitting in the seat for the first time, that process of change that you're developing will kind of go with you. And it's kind of like a tool that you'll need to work on. I don't know. There's something I thought about a few months ago that I've been pondering. I haven't written anything on this yet, Jason, but pondering it is how we go into a new church and we see cultures that we think need to be changed, and it's hard to change culture. And so I think that first major thing to implement is to ask yourself, is this cultural change that we're trying to make a difference in really a positive or a negative? I mean, you think about the churches we go into, some of those may be new pastor comes in and they've told him they're a certain translation only or a certain dress only. And that becomes the hill this guy wants to die on. And in the big scheme of things, that's not the bigger importance of change.
Yeah, I think culture is huge, and every church has their own unique culture. And that new pastor also, when he comes in, he's also got his own culture that he's
Right.
used to. And I remember this way back in seminary. One of the comments I heard, it was particularly in missions, is that when we see a different culture, it's not necessarily wrong. It's not inferior to our own culture. It's just different. And so when a new pastor goes into a church, sometimes he may view that culture, even though it's different, he may view it negatively and want to rush in and change that culture. And that's usually a recipe for a difficult early ministry.
Yeah. And I think the key word you said there was rush. This we're talking about major change. We're not talking about I love the way you started these podcasts out with your very first. You talked about moving the pulpit. And that's just a really great example. I thought that was a great example of this whole implementing change is we do things so quickly. And so yeah, I say this a lot in my world. We got to think about where we are. So this church we're in, when you start making a change, you got to remember you're not on a John boat, you're on a cruise liner. So when you start whipping that thing to change it real quickly, if you're on a cruise liner, you're going to throw some people off. And I think that's the illustration that I want to use because it paints that vivid picture that it's going to affect a lot of folks.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So, we want to be talking about in this particular episode implementing major change. But before we kind of dive into those questions, what are some examples of major changes that a new pastor might consider early in his ministry?
Yeah, maybe a leadership structure. We've just finished a document that we're using with Constitution and bylaws rewrite. There's a lot of old Constitution and bylaws. Let's just use that for an example, Jason, because you know how this is. When a pastor first comes to a church and the first thing he wants to change is the Constitution and bylaws, it should send up a red flag. That should be a big one that we shouldn't kind of walk through. But I think looking at the organizational structure of a church, or it may be implementing change, and if it has staff, if the guy's lucky enough to have part-time staff or volunteer staff, what does that change look like, and what are those things he sees? Because I think major change really could happen really early if it's talked about this way. I think what happened was in years past they would say, don't change anything for 6 months to a year. Just go in and love on your people. And I think there's still some truth to that. But I think the value and the cost of pastoral change in a church, I think we can wait too long before we start implementing some change. I'm a gradual change guy. I think change needs to be made in a gradual state. So, you think about what are some changes. I think it might be tweaking an order of service. I went into a church a couple of weeks ago and preached like you do. We get invited into a lot of churches. And before I preached that morning, they had sung 6 hymns and a choir anthem. And so I think you see some things that we could attribute to maybe needing some change of that matter. I think one thing to change, I think everybody should change as a new pastor is try to change the heart of leaders to be on the page of wherever the church is. So that may be, I tell a lot of first time pastors, find you a good book and sit down with your deacons, get to know them, work through those kind of things and change hearts to a unified structure.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know if
So
that helps.
yeah, absolutely. So I heard several different categories of changes that you talked about there. You talked about organizational,
Mhm.
structural, personnel. Other major changes might be a major renovation to the sanctuary or a relocation or even a church plant. All those are different changes that a pastor might consider early on. Some of them, as far as the category of it being a major change versus a minor change, is kind of in the eye of the beholder because a pastor may view a tweak to the worship service as a very minor change, where a church member who has been used to the same service for 50 years would view that as a major change. And so I think that goes back to even what you mentioned there, getting to know your leaders and listening well. It's one of the kind of the priorities of starting well is listening well and learning well is to find what might be some of those landmines. I've used that term in the past that if you step on it, you're going to cause a lot of collateral damage. I think sometimes that classification of change is really in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, and I think too what you said, I think all of those are reasonable major changes. But I think if a guy goes in his first year, he doesn't have to think about, well, in the next year, I want to see us building a building or I want to see us planting a church. I mean, he may be called to a place and the Lord may open his eyes to something that needs to be done, but that doesn't mean it has to be done today or tomorrow. So many times, guys just die on the heel of change in some sort of, I mean, you go into one of our rural churches, change needs to happen, but that speed of change is so slow. You just have to know you have to know that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Jeff, you wrote an article for us on startingwell.net. By the way, you can go and you can read that article there. But you list 6 different questions that a new pastor should consider before implementing major change, however you define that. And so, I'd like to spend most of our time in this conversation just kind of walking through those 6 questions, and I'll let you comment on each of those and explain to our listeners kind of what you mean by those questions. So the first question is this: whenever you're considering a major change, the first question is, have I prayed about this change? Why don't you speak to that one for us?
Sure. I think sometimes I'm so guilty of acting before praying. The thing that I came to understand many years ago was two of the greatest gifts God gives the church is number one, his word. He wants us to handle that really well. But the second thing is his people. And those are his people and not ours. And so we have to understand that we're an under shepherd, that we're responsible for being led by God. And so is this change God given? What would God require of that? And if you get to a place of seeking the Lord on it and he's not giving you clarity on it, I think that just tells you it's not time yet. What we have to understand is prayer is the fuel. Prayer is the strategy to develop first in any kind of change. Out of that prayer strategy personally is finding those people that are people of peace, I would call them, but finding a group of people that you're not selling the idea to. You're just asking them, hey, it looks like we've got something that we're going to be needing to talk about as a congregation. And these are people that are highly trusted. These are people that are prayer warriors possibly, and encouraging them and inviting them into the process, into that first process of seeking the Lord in change. if it's his church, then he has a direction.
When it comes to prayer, if a new pastor is anything like I am, a lot of time prayer is assumed. We talk about prayer a lot, but how much time do we actually spend in prayer? And so I think that being the first question is a great way for a pastor to really start to think about changes. Have I really prayed about this? Have I thought about it a lot or have I prayed about it a lot? And I think if you want to implement change well, I think you need to do both. You need to think about it a lot, but you also need to pray about it a lot.
And I think through that prayer time, God's going to tent your heart be revealed. He's going to reveal real truth to you. Maybe that culture that you're really wanting to change is really not the greatest thing that you need to do. What does that look like? And who are those people that can join with me in prayer? And then be open enough. Here's another thing. Be open enough to those folks that are praying with you to go back and say, what has God shown you in this process? Is he telling you anything? So, yeah, I think it's a very important piece. I think it's the most important piece, to be honest with you. That's why it was question one.
Yeah, I agree. So, number one, have I prayed about this change? A second question that you also mentioned is who will be responsible for making this decision about change?
Yeah, I think this one's a slippery slope, could be, because, I think you have to examine that structure, that leadership structure in the church, because there may be some ministries or situations that could fall under multiple ministries. And so you need to ask the right question. You need to ask who's responsible for that. It might be Gertrude, may be the greatest advocate of this particular ministry, and she's not even on the committee. The who is responsible for making the change and working with that committee or working with that team is going to be very important, because they may be at a place where they're going, well, Pastor, I've never thought of that. We never saw it that way. And man, that's such a real and an amazing answer to the question. And they go, but we'd be open to explore that. I mean, that's great. I wish we could say we heard that every time. But then you get that naysayer who goes, "Oh, we tried that before. That won't work." And you say really, and tell me about that. But yeah, I think this whole point here is that you can't just go out and make change in a vacuum. If you're the change maker and you've got the attitude in your mind that you're going to make these things happen, get your resume ready. I mean, how many times have we seen that? Because I think it's really important to understand that change comes when we allow the structure of the church to embrace what changes need to be made. And in fact, you understand that people share ownership of that change as well. And that's the kind of ingredient you need in that new pastor.
Yeah, this really goes back to, again, thinking through those priorities, listening well, because change cannot be made in a vacuum. And so you've got to have other people involved in owning it, in discussing it, and implementing it. So I think that's a great question. All right, so number three, what will this change cost, in particular in ministry, time, resources, or people?
Yeah, I think you have to weigh that out. I think there's cost to every change. If you're a new pastor, it costs that church quite a bit of investment to bring you as a new pastor. It costs them time in ministry. It costs them financially. It costs lay people's extra work in being on a team. And so when we start thinking about the cost of change, it's huge. For instance, if you're thinking about ministry, sometimes if we're going to change a ministry, it might impact an ongoing ministry now. How does that impact what we're currently doing? How does that impact the people we're doing? I know a larger church here in Bowling Green several years ago was looking for a relocation. That was a major change for them. And so they took one of their staff people and they put him in charge of just the new building that they were going to build in this transition. And they started working on this, and about 2 years in, the church decided that it wasn't feasible for them to build that building. Well, guess what? He didn't have a job. And so the cost of change there took focus and vision and funding, but it also took a person who'd been a caregiver to the congregation. And, they didn't think about the long-term aspect of that. 2 years in, we can't make this thing work. So, to be willy-nilly on change, it's very important. Let's talk about the positive things about change. Change can impact the way a community sees your church if it's an outward change. An inward change is how your worshipers feel about coming or how the ministry inside works. Jason, we work with a lot of this right now. Some of the big changes that are going on in a lot of our churches right now is the way we handle children, maybe even a check-in system. I think about this. I was doing training for the church prepared training in Glasgow several months ago. And there was an older lady in the room who'd been working in children's ministry for 40 years. And we're telling them that you're going to have to get a background check and you're going to have yearly meeting to go to raise your game. And I was just anticipating this dear sister going, I've been doing this for 40 years. I've heard it all. And she said, I think that's good. And the pastor was just startled. And she says, I think this is good because if I do it, then everybody should be seeing that. And so that's a positive change. She saw the great value in that, right? Of course, the negative side of that is that if we don't evaluate where we're going, if we're just changing for changing's sake, then that's when it gets really tough. It costs too much to change something inside a church to change for change's sake. To be doing something this week and then next month we forgot about it and slipped it off. If it was so important that what was going to happen is, Jason, you know this, that when we go into this cost of change, if the change goes really bad, we're going to lose people. The people that were encouraged by this or saw this as something positive. And if we fall flat on our face with this change, then people leave, right? I think you must think about, what does this do to our other ministries? I've got a church right now struggling with filling up a building. And I'm saying, well, you need to have a second worship service. And this pastor's eyes get big and says, my people don't want to do two. And I said, it's cheaper to do two than to build a bigger building, But what does that time do to your people when you start asking people to come more? What does that do to their lives? And then what additional resources or people you need? So I think those are things you just got to ask yourself.
Yeah, I think that's a great question because the reality is that every change costs something.
Yeah.
And so you need to really think through as a new pastor, what will this particular change cost? Because it's going to cost something. And so you need to know that beforehand. I think a lot of times pastors get in trouble because they make a change without thinking about the cost.
Yeah.
And so I think it's very helpful to think about that question before you make the change.
And you may want to, as a pastor, you may want to find a mentor if you're in the state, even a regional consultant, to come along the side and play the what if game. Hey, help me think through what all could this cost me? What could this cost the church if we make this change? So, I think that's another thing with these questions, Jason, is pastoral role sometimes is such a guarded role because we feel inferior if we can't make this decision by ourselves. And man, there goes back to, you can't create change in a vacuum. Well, you know what? You can't make change on a desert island either. I want to find people that can talk into my life, speak into my life.
And that's a great place to pause this conversation. Again, tune in next week and you'll hear the second half of this conversation between me and Jeff Crabtree. But before I let you go, at the end of next week's episode, Jeff is going to offer some recommended resources that you might want to look at to help you think through this issue. But I want to offer two as well at the end of this episode. And so the two books that I want to recommend to you are Leading Major Change in Your Ministry by Jeff Iorg and Who Moved My Pulpit? Leading Change in the Church by Thom Rainer. The Rainer book is much smaller and kind of gives you some of the principles of how you can lead change in your church in kind of bite-sized nuggets. And then for a fuller, more detailed explanation of how to lead major change in your ministry, then you can get the Iorg book. These are fantastic resources. In fact, the Leading Major Change in Your Ministry book by Jeff Iorg is the number one resource that I recommend on this topic. And so, again, if you serve in Kentucky as a Kentucky Baptist pastor, then reach out to your regional consultant and we'll make sure that you can get a copy of this resource, or we'll point you to where you can find a copy of either the Iorg resource or Thom Rainer. And if you don't serve in Kentucky, I'll put the link to these resources in the show notes, and you can be sure to grab a copy on Amazon or wherever you purchase your books. I just wanted to make sure that you know that these are two high-quality resources that truly will be a help to you as you seek to implement change in your church. Until next time, may you shepherd the flock of God among you well. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Starting Well podcast. For more resources, please visit us online at startingwell.net. For more information about the Kentucky Baptist Convention, go to kybaptist.org.